Welcome to the Books and Benches podcast, where we bring you reviews, recommendations, author interviews, and more. This is MK McClintock, and I'm here with Mary Frances Fisher, author of the historical murder mystery Paradox Forged in Blood. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, MK.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. And you?
I'm doing well. We're already laughing, and nobody who hears this interview is going to know why, but that's okay. At least we're going to have a good time.
Yes, as well.
We're going to spend some time today getting to know Ellen O'Malley and learning more about Millionaire's Row and the American Boom. But first, can you tell us what started you on your path of writing? And did you always want to be an author?
Well, ever since I was little, I loved to write, and my teachers encouraged me, but life went on and I really didn't take the time. Shortly after my mother's death, I was dealing with grief and depression, and I needed a positive outlet, and I turned to writing. And I wrote a story with her as the main character in a murder mystery because she loved murder mysteries.
Paradox Forged in Blood is your debut novel, a story interwoven with both fact and fiction. What inspired you to write this specific story with a focus on the fictional murder of Louis Sheridan and a partial backdrop of World War II?
Well, as I just mentioned, my mother loved murder mysteries, so it seemed appropriate that I would cast her in the middle of a juicy murder mystery in the 1930s. As far as the Sheridan name, some of my ancestors were actually the Sheridans. And as far as the first name, Louis, who is the man who gets murdered in the book, that was named after my uncle and my cousin.
And was there something specific that inspired this particular murder? It is a juicy murder, and it's not really where it takes place. It's not really a place where you consider murders to take place. So how did you come up with this murder?
Well, I've always been fascinated by Millionaire's Row. When I was younger, my parents would take all of us kids in the car, and we would drive over to the homes that were still remaining on Millionaire's Row. And we would awe at the beautiful mansions and the landscapes, and it was like a fantasy land, and it was a wonderful memory for me. So if I was going to put a murder anywhere, why not Millionaire's Row? I mean, it's kind of an unusual backdrop because there was so much wealth and beauty. You wouldn't associate a murder with that. And that's a little bit of the paradox in there.
Yeah, you wouldn't. And so it was kind of a little bit of a surprise there. And part of the story takes place against the backdrop of World War II. When you first started writing out this story, did you know that you wanted to write during this time period, or was there something else that inspired that?
Well, I've always been drawn to that time period. My mother used to call me an old soul, and she was right. I would have happily lived in the 30s and 40s without a lot of the modern technology of today. But for me, that time frame actually began when I was 6 years old. I became fascinated by my neighbor's grandmother who was visiting. And she used to sit in a rocking chair just staring out the window, and she never spoke. And one day she wore a sleeveless top, and she had numbers tattooed on her arm. So I went to my friend's mother and said, "Why does your mother have numbers tattooed?" And she told me she was in a German concentration camp. And ever since then, I've been fascinated by the Nazis and Hitler and the impact that they had on society in that time frame. So that is another reason why I enjoyed writing about the Nazis and have always been fascinated by that time frame. One thing I didn't realize, and I've probably seen just about every documentary on World War II, Nazis and Hitler, and the so-called Jewish solution, or the Jewish problem, as they called it, was the fact that in America, we had the German-American Bund, which actually it started in the early 1920s. Then it was called the group, just the New Germany. And it was based on a lot of German refugees who were disillusioned after World War I and the deteriorating conditions in their country. So they came over here and they started kind of a social group. But eventually, when Hitler came into power, it changed its name to the German American Boons, and they hid behind Christianity values and getting jobs for Germans who were discriminated against. But they had to pledge their loyalty to Hitler, and they had to go along with the ideals of anti-Semitism. And I never knew that this group grew to between 25 and 50,000 people. And in 1939, they marched down Main Street in New York, and they held a huge rally at Madison Square Garden. So that was a whole other aspect of the Nazi image that I wanted to share with others because it was so fascinating to me as well.
Well, it is fascinating. It's not something that I remember ever learning anything about in history class in school. And it's a part of that time period and even American history that we don't think about here because we've always assumed, well, the war took place somewhere else. And it's nice to remember that it touched us here very much and a lot more than people often realize.
That's right. As a matter of fact, I had seen a movie called The House on 92nd Street, and it was all about the German-American Boons subterfuge. It was a spy ring in America, and it was before the war. And it was a movie that was sponsored by the FBI. And I just found that absolutely fascinating.
Your interest started in a lot of this history at a young age. Did all of the research that you do for this book come from reading, or did you have other sources?
A lot of it came from reading. A lot of it came from documentaries, but probably my greatest source for a lot of information during that time frame in America had to do with my parents and my aunts and uncles. They all lived into their 90s, so they were just a wealth of information and a wonderful source whenever I had questions about events and the way that things were done back long before I was born.
And has your family recognized their own history when they read this book?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, they're fascinated by it because they're reliving what they went through. And they're seeing it through fresh eyes, which would be my eyes. And they're delighted.
Well, I think that would be wonderful to be able to have that kind of rich source material right there and get from firsthand that kind of historical information in the stories that most people just don't get unless they research it.
I was extremely lucky.
Is there a part of the story that makes it special to you on a personal level?
On a personal level, I think it's all about the truth. To me, the most important thing is that the truth should always be pursued at all costs, despite the events in life that sometimes deter us from that goal. I think the truth carries tremendous power, and only we can decide how it will impact our lives and the lives of those around us.
Well, that's a wonderful message, and I know that it comes across in the novel, and it was very well done in the midst of the murder and the family history and the family saga and World War II. There is a deeper message to the story, which is nice.
Well, thank you.
Two of the characters in this story are based in part on your real life parents. Can you tell us how much and which characters?
Oh, absolutely. Ellen O'Malley was my mother. She was a delightful, warm-hearted, loving woman who had a great sense of humor. I think she would be so pleased to find that she's embroiled in a murder mystery. And my father, Frank, kind of funny. Someone asked me at a Meet the Author event, they said, "Was your father a detective?" And I laughed and I said, "In real life, my father was a mailman." I said, "But I honestly couldn't come up with a way that a mailman would solve a murder mystery."
Well, your father would probably be tickled that he got to play detective in your story.
I'm sure of it. And he loved to read. So, yes, he would have loved this.
Well, and that brings us to the project you're working on next. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Growing Up O'Malley. It's a whimsical story about the O'Malleys, and there are 8 children. It's in the early 1900s, And it shows how they struggle through discrimination, the Great Depression, and World War II. And they combat all those with strength and humor and strong family ties.
Now, is this next work, it's based a lot on your family history, but is there fiction mixed in with it as well?
A little bit of fiction, and I always throw some historical parts in there weaved in through the story because I love history.
Well, it shows. What readers have been saying about Paradox Forged in Blood? If this book is an indication of things to come, we will be hearing a lot about Mary Frances Fisher. She's that good. Mary Frances Fisher took all of these scenarios and put them together to create a murder mystery with a twist, a love story, and historical fiction. I was completely caught up in the story and could not put it down. There is something for every reader in this book. This story had it all. The plot and the characters were believable, and the storytelling was superb. You just found yourself wrapped up in the events and felt like you were truly part of the story. How does it make you feel to read some of these things online from readers for your debut novel?
When I read the positive reviews, it's so important to me because this was a book that was close to my heart. It helped me to deal with the death of my mother and recently the death of my father as well. And I was extremely proud of the fact that others enjoyed the storytelling and traveling back in time as much as I did.
Well, I know a lot of readers have enjoyed it, and I am sure there are many more who are going to be thrilled to read more about the family saga, the romance, the history, and all of the other wonderful elements that can be found in Paradox Forged in Blood. And we look forward to reading your next book, Growing Up O'Malley. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you've enjoyed spending time with Mary Frances Fisher as much as we have. You may learn more about the author at our website, maryfrancesfisher.com, and you may find her books in ebook and paperback formats at your favorite online bookstores. Mary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, MK. It's been an absolute delight.